This episode of 50 Shades of Planning is brought to you in partnership with Kratos Group. We are a leading communications consultancy, helping some of the UK's best-known brands deliver local and national campaigns, manage political and reputational risks, and influence national policy on some of the most important issues facing the UK. Find out more at kratos.co.uk.
Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting this time from a hotel room in London. In anticipation of the revised NPPF, the consultation deadline for which at the time of recording is starting to loom large, I invited some of the Shades alumni to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them and how the new government could and should approach them. 8 conversations were recorded, elements of which you might have heard formed part of episode 128 of the podcast, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the 6th of the 8, which is a conversation between Nicola Gooch, Mike Kiely and Paul Smith about Greybelt. Nicola is a partner in the planning team at Irwin Mitchell. Mike is an ex-chief planner, now independent consultant working mainly in the public sector. And Paul is managing director at the Strategic Land Group. Their conversation takes in the public perception of Greenbelt versus what it actually is, how to define what Greybelt may or may not be, the government's proposed golden rules, BNG, and land value capture. Enjoy.
So Sam has asked us to have a little bit of a chat about Labour's Greybelt initiative, which is a little bit harder to define in advance of the NPPF consultation coming out, which is where we're expecting to get a little bit more detail about it, but let's give it a go. This is the idea, which fundamentally at a high level I agree with, that not all parts of the Greenbelt are created equal, and that there are some parts of it which are less valuable or constructive or functional than others. And this is what they have badged the Greybelt land. They use the word ugly. I don't like the word ugly. I think it's too
ugly.
I was going to say ambiguous and hard to define, but that's the lawyer in me. I'm a lawyer. I like precise definitions, and ugly is very hard to have one. I mean, how do you spot an ugly baby? It's one of those types of things.
You know it when you see it now.
Yeah. Or poorly functioning, I think.
We do already.
So go on.
I was going to say, we do already have the concept of beauty in national policy. So, it was only a matter of time before we had the concept of ugliness as well, surely.
Yeah, we turned that coin over.
Oh, this is true, but I also objected beauty being part of national policy. So we digress. So it's this idea that for those less well-functioning parts of the Greenbelt, which we are now calling Greybelt, they talk about car parks and former industrial areas, those types of things, in the right locations, they should be released from the Greenbelt for development. And they have set out some golden rules or golden principles about what they want to achieve when this happens, which include the provision of high levels of affordable housing, amongst various other things, ensuring that infrastructure comes forward as part of it. I can't remember the others, and I didn't have them written down before I came onto here, which was very silly. So if either of you can remember what the others are, that would be brilliantly helpful. But if not, they have a set of golden rules that they want to achieve as part of this release. And the idea is that where they can meet those golden tests and achieve what they want to achieve from it, they will release this poorly functioning Greenbelt for the purposes of development. In a nutshell, if you want more detail, then please go and look it up, because I didn't. So that's really what's being proposed. It's been talked about for a while. It was first discussed pre-manifesto, then it was in the manifesto, and it's been talked about since the election. And this leads on to Mike's first question, which is, where did it originally come from? And I think the answer is, we don't know.
No, but I think it comes from a misunderstanding of the Greenbelt. You talk about those areas being poorly functioning, but the purpose of the Greenbelt as set out in the NPPF and as previously set out all the way back to the minister who introduced it, who said, even if neither green nor particularly attractive scenically, the major function of the Greenbelt is to stop further urban development. So every part of the Greenbelt functions really well because it stops London and the other cities and large towns from sprawling. So this is, I think the problem we've had with the Greenbelt is people see it as an environmental policy, which it isn't. It's an urban containment zone. It's to stop cities, metropolis, big towns from sprawling so that we don't damage the countryside. We don't have ribbon development. And it does that very well. The fact that it's ugly doesn't matter. That's not part of its function to be beautiful. Its function is to stop urban sprawl. So it comes from a misunderstanding of the Greenbelt and its role. What the NPPF should say is that you must do a proper job in working out your housing need, and we could have a whole program on the standard methodology and whether that does it well. But we seem to be moving to a regional or a strategic or doing strategic planning more properly, or hopefully properly. So hopefully we will start to work out our housing numbers properly with policy off, and then distribute them with policy on, so that councils who are full of AONB or whatever it might be don't get the same as those who haven't got that, so that the councils have a realistic opportunity of accommodating that growth. But what the NPPF should say is that accommodating that growth, it's a brownfield first strategy. New towns, if that's in there, then that needs to be clearly set out. If after that there's a residual housing number, it should say you must review your Greenbelt in order to find those sites. Not you can review it if you fancy it, but don't worry if you don't find anything. I think you should be required to review the Greenbelt, i.e. take the Greenbelt off, look for sustainable development sites, preferably those that are ugly, to use the parlance, but first and foremost, they must be sustainable sites. There's no point in doing unsustainable development in the middle of nowhere in a countryside. We can't afford to do that. The planet can't afford us to be doing stuff like that. So that's what it should say, and it hasn't said that for a long, long time, because the politics around it sees it as a environmental policy, whereas it's not that. It's a strategic spatial policy that you need to review when you need to review it.
What do you think, Paul?
I largely agree with what Mike said, that we know how misunderstood Greenbelt is. There was a great poll that CPRE did a few years ago, and I talk about this all the time. I get the numbers slightly wrong, but they're broadly right. That it's 70-something% of people think the Greenbelt should be protected from development under any circumstances, and a slightly higher percentage of people who said that they didn't really know what the Greenbelt was.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of encapsulates the challenge that we have to face. And, fundamentally, as Mike said, it's there to manage growth. So we should be looking at how we can deliver growth in other ways first. But then if you do need to release areas of Greenbelt, you should be looking to do that, as almost the final step on the ladder.
Yeah.
To get you to where you need to be, subject to all the other stuff that you talked about, Mike, which I don't really disagree with. I think the grey belt concept, when Labour first started talking about it, it appeared as though it was almost going to be sort of shorthand for those areas of Greenbelt which don't really perform a Greenbelt role, because we know there are some of those, or those areas that, aren't the green belt that people of the popular imagination, that it was a way of trying to shift the narrative. And I think in that regard, it's quite a powerful concept, and quite a helpful concept to try and move that debate and try and help explain to the public what the green belt really is. I think where I would be a little bit more concerned is the fact that we seem to be going to have something that's going to be written international policy with a precise definition, which is a really hard thing to do, by the way. Incredibly hard. You know, that there's some things like, you know, at one end it's maybe quite easy. There are maybe types of land with buildings on it which aren't captured by the current definition of previously development land. You know, that you could include chicken sheds, plant nurseries, those sorts of things that lots of people, you know, the general public probably wouldn't know that they're not brownfield in planning policy terms. You know, things like that are a little bit easier to capture with a new definition like this. It's a little bit easier to capture things like perhaps allowing the more intensive redevelopment of previously development sites in the Greenbelt. You know, a more relaxed approach to concepts of openness when they're being redeveloped. So if you've got a storage yard with loads of shipping containers, you know, that isn't really open in practical terms, but in planning policy terms quite is. You know, there's things around that you could maybe pick up, but we really are playing at the margins of what impact it's going to have here. And all the stuff about ugly and wasteland gets really incredibly difficult. And, you know, my concern is really that it attracts too much of the focus and takes too much of the attention and time and political effort away from some of the things that will deliver a much bigger impact and much bigger improvement, which are some of the sort of really boring, tedious, systemic improvements where we can sort of fine tune and hone what we've already got going. If that makes sense.
I agree. I think there's a flaw in the current way that we approach it, in that when you're allowing development in the Greenbelt that's necessary, you know, residential development, that you're still bound by this sort of the Greenbelt as this concept of openness, and we need to maintain it. And I think that's a fundamental flaw. I think the Greenbelt has that concept of openness when it is Greenbelt, but my view and the view of the Planning Office Society is that if you need to find housing sites within the Greenbelt, it stops being Greenbelt. You look for sustainable, first and foremost, sustainable sites, preferably that are grey belt rather than, you know, green fields. But if you have to develop on green fields, so what? You know, every single house in the country used to be a green field or a forest or whatever. You know, unless you live in a cave, you know, when your house or the ones before that was first built, it was a greenfield site. So, you know, let's get over that. This is about, you know, how we plan new development, and we need to make the most of the land that we release and to build sustainably. Now, not, you know, massively out of character with the area. You know, I'm not talking about 50-story towers in villages, but, you know, we shouldn't be developing at very low densities. And particularly, we shouldn't be developing in locations that must rely solely on the car. You know, we need to do much better than that.
So I think we're all agreed on a couple of things, actually, which is, one, this should be a strategic review, a local plan stage, or if you need to do a standalone Greenbelt boundary review, then that's what it should be.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be site-by-site development management considerations. Would that be right?
I think it depends on the definition, doesn't it? And, you know, I'm sort of, I don't have a strong view one way or the other, but if you were to find yourself in a situation where the definition of grey belt, let me come at it from a different angle. The definition of previously developed land, it's possible to use that definition, identify sites in isolation, look at a piece of land, is that previously developed or not? And if the definition of grey belt enables the same sort of binary interpretation of a particular site, is it grey belt or isn't it? Then almost inevitably it's going to start getting dragged into the DM sphere, because there will be circumstances where it might be that, you know, ideally, because all development is plan-led, but there may be circumstances in some authorities where those sites are open to planning applications, just as, you know, other non-green belt areas of land would be.
Now,
potentially. But again, it comes down to the definition, doesn't it? And how, the 5 golden rules, one of them is brownfield should be prioritised over the grey belt and all these sorts of things. And how does that all sort of dovetail together? It's hard, actually.
it really is. I mean, I'd rather assumed, and this might be a naive assumption, that the grey belt policy was going to be additional to our existing green belt policy.
Additional or a part of.
Well, as in layered over the top to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So that we'd still have very special circumstances, we'd still have the release tests that we have there at the moment, where replacement is okay, previously development land is easier, all of those types of things that already exist would stay. And we'd still have very special circumstances. So the greenbelt sites that come forward at the moment still probably would if they could show VSC. And that this would be more about allocations. And review and release. Although I see what you're saying, Paul, about if they tweak previously developed land, if they've got their 5 golden rules, I can see how that, if you can hit those 5 golden rules, I can see that coming in on appeal.
Well, that's where it's all going to get very confusing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, for me,
it could almost.
I was just going to say on brownfield, for me, the problem with our current policy approach to brownfield is that when you win the argument, you generally develop it in an unsustainable way. You're restricted in terms of this protecting the openness of the greenbelt concept, which I think now in the 21st century with the sustainable development challenges is not the right approach. It might have been the right approach in the 40s and 50s when we were originally crafting greenbelt policy. So I think there is a need to rethink it. I think there is a need to recognise that releasing the greenbelt is something that must happen when it needs to happen, and we need to frame policy that does that in the most sustainable way that we can, because everything we do should be as sustainable as it can be. We can't afford to do anything less, and that's why I think the role of brownfield sites within this concept, how the grey belt is actually defined, how it operates in the DM sphere is going to be crucial. And I'm worried it's going to end in tears, and we're going to be messing things up and bringing forward, nice big houses in the countryside where we should be intensifying the development around our train stations and, tube stations, etc., at reasonably high densities. And, that would benefit those town centres, village centres, in terms of footfall, more people live in there, therefore the shops can survive. That's my vision of how we can do this properly in terms of development that both meets our housing need, but also produces beneficial outcomes. Not just in terms of housing, but in terms of town planning generally.
And I think that speaks to a different but related issue with all of this, which is, like I said earlier, in an ideal world, development comes forward through the local plan system. But we know that for all sorts of reasons, many of them systemic, that we're struggling to get the level of local plan coverage that we need.
Yeah.
And now, in lots of cases, that's nothing to do with greenbelt policy, but there are some authorities where the politics of progressing a local plan is too difficult because they are shrink wrapped in greenbelt. Any local plan will almost inevitably need a modicum of greenbelt release, and that is politically unpalatable. So actually, the politically rational thing to do is almost to soft pedal it and not do it very quickly, because you've got protection from I was trying to be more polite than that, Mike, but unplanned, because you've got the greenbelt policy to protect you from unplanned planning applications. And it's interesting to see how Greybelt sort of fits into all of that, because there needs to be some encouragement for those authorities to progress local plans. And there's lots of different ways that can be done. You know, the Secretary of State already has powers of intervention which aren't used. There's a whole, you know, we could sit here and come up with 20 other ideas that would all help. But one of the things that could factor into that is if the grey belt policy did allow applications to come forward a little bit earlier in those circumstances, maybe that would provide some political motivation, because it is driven by the politicians, isn't it? It's not officers that sat there not wanting to do a local plan. It could provide some political motivation to say, you know what, we need to get going a bit with this.
How's this for a potential new greenbelt policy? So it says what I said before. So, you know, you must look at your housing, daddy-daddy-da. If you've got a residual housing need, you must review your greenbelt. If you don't, then your greenbelt will cease to exist. Development will be assessed on the basis of its sustainability and its appropriateness for meeting housing need in the most sustainable way, you know, something like that. You know, then that incentive to be busy doing nothing falls away. And I think it also, rather than just having this sort of nebulous tilted balance, it sort of focuses those decisions on, you know, if you like, what you would have done if you were doing a greenbelt review. Do you see what I mean? Hard policy to draft. It's just an idea that popped into my head. Yeah.
It's also probably...
It's almost like having to have your greenbelt... Go on, go, Nicola. Sorry, I'll shut up.
No, I was just saying that it's the difficulty here, and it's a trap I often fall into myself, but it's one we need to be very aware of, is are we being a little bit too housing focused when we're talking about greenbelt review? Do we also need to include industrial space, logistics?
Yeah, totally. You know, you know, whatever we're saying about housing applies, must apply across the piece. Unfortunately, the focus of planning, and particularly local plans, has been housing for decades. You know, at least 2 decades. But you're totally right. Yeah, and particularly logistics as going forward, it's ridiculous, particularly around London. You know, trying to get a logistics operation for Amazon to serve, you know, central London, they're looking the other side of Watford, sort of thing. You know, the sites aren't there. So, yeah, I completely agree. It needs to be proper planning.
Sorry, Paul, you were saying?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think what's interesting about, I mean, you're right, it is more than housing. But what's interesting about the grey belt policy is how housing focused it seems to be. It has, you know, it's always talked about in the context of that 1.5 million homes over the life of the Parliament. One of the 5 golden rules is that half of the new homes delivered should be affordable housing. You know, that's it's talking in terms of this is for housing sites. It doesn't even seem to consider that maybe these sites will be more appropriate for other uses. Because you could conceivably have a grey belt site, which isn't a great location for housing, but is brilliant for logistics or lab space or, you know, something else. And again, it'll be interesting to see how those sorts of things are all factored in, as well as and when the policy comes forward. Yeah,
we've had another solar farm approval this morning.
Have we?
Okay. Yeah. This one from the ministry, MHCLG. That's going to take some getting used to.
Yeah. We've got it out of our heads. We've got to get it back in again, haven't we? Yeah. I wouldn't mind spending a bit of time on the 50% affordable housing sort of issue. You know, providing housing is important, but providing affordable housing, proper affordable housing, is arguably even more important. And there's this sort of notion that it should max out on that. I think, you know, the rationale behind that is that, you know, the site is a greenbelt site, therefore it's got no hope value. You know, the greenbelt is pretty clear that you ain't going to be developing it anytime soon, Sonny, you know. So it's a perfectly legitimate policy position to have, to say, you know, just because we are strategically releasing greenbelt land doesn't mean its value increases to normal residential development values, and
But it's
therefore you need to calm down
yeah,
and recognise the planning policy reality.
but it only works in a strategic concept. It
Oh,
doesn't
absolutely.
context. As a policy, it does not work for speculative schemes, which might be the very point of it, to be fair. Because if you've got I don't know, an infill piece of greenbelt, so if you imagine a triangle where the field in the middle of the triangle is greenbelt, but it has actually been developed on either side, filling that in, if you had very special circumstances, you might be able to get that through on appeal as you might, depending on context.
Only if there's a tilted balance, yeah.
Yeah, there's tilted balance and other bits and bobs, and you've got your VSCs, and it all stacks up. But one of those sites which you might be able to get through on appeal at the moment, there will have been some hope value there. There will have been some speculation there. There will have been investment in it there, which means
But is that
at
realistic,
that
and
point,
should you respect it? That's the point.
well, right now we don't have the greenbelt policy in. I mean, the grey belt policy in. So quite how this 50% golden rule thing stacks up with those kind of speculative sites, which do tend to come through at the moment, it will be an interesting circle to square, because it previously hasn't been.
Yeah, I'd make a couple of points on that. I think the first is you've accidentally stumbled into one of my bugbears there, Nicola, which is I hate the description speculative applications. Because honestly, with the planning system we have at the minute, every single planning application is speculative, right? The outcome is uncertain. Unplanned is a much better description of what they are.
Apologies.
In my
Unplanned.
view. But I think more fundamentally, that's all right, unplanned. But what's interesting about that 50% affordable housing target, and there are some baked in assumptions with that around what grey belt land actually is. Because, Mike talked about, well, this land is in the green belt and therefore the value of it isn't huge, and there's a huge uplift when planning permission is granted. That's true if the site isn't already developed in some way. But we've talked about how the definition of grey belt could actually be designed to capture storage yards, petrol stations, chicken sheds, and those sorts of properties will have an existing use value that is, in excess of a greenfield agricultural value.
And
there is a point,
costs.
especially when something's and there is a point at which and lots of them, almost all of them, are being run as a business of some kind. And there is a point at which the owners of those pieces of land will say, you know what, I'd rather just carry on operating it as a business because this concept might change. I might be able to get it through, a future local plan. I'm going to struggle to find premises to relocate because what I'm doing isn't actually all that great. I've got all these shipping containers and people are going to object to it and try and put them somewhere else. And that all of a sudden starts to push up what the landowner is willing to accept to make it worth the while. So there is an interesting sort of breakdown in the thought process, or disconnect in the thought process there, in terms of how that will factor in. Yeah. And again, it's fascinating that the announcement, when Angela Rayner talked about the golden rule, she said a target of half the homes as affordable housing. Yeah. So again, how the word target gets translated into policy is important, because if we're not careful, this could end up with, we'll spend hours talking about it, and it's not inconceivable that this ends up as a policy like first homes exception sites, which we all remember and all talked about. And I think I'm right in saying they didn't deliver any new homes, or didn't deliver any to a first approximation. So we just need to be mindful of those sorts of issues as well, I think.
Well, I think it's legitimate, particularly in the concept of the green belt, to have planning policies that seek to manage value expectations, in the wider public interest. And you're right, the car breakers or whatever it might be may well think it's not worthwhile, and that actually is perhaps a good outcome. They've got to go somewhere. So if they're already there, they're providing that service, etc., they're not causing nuisance. Not developing them for housing, particularly if they're in the middle of nowhere, is, in my view, a good bit of planning. So I think it is complex, but I think we do need to be clearer in our planning policies about land value capture in the broadest sense, how these sort of assumptions operate in terms of what is a reasonable land value. And what POS has been pushing for is not so much changes to CPO, because the problem with the CPO is the P bit. You've got to buy the land, and we haven't got the money to buy the land. But a CSO, compulsory selling order. So if you've got a piece of land that is an ideal housing site, say in the Greenbelt, and you're pushing for that to come forward, and you've got expectations around infrastructure and affordable housing, but the landowner is greedy, frankly, their expectations are too high, then to go through a CPO type process, but the result of which is got to be sold. And what we're saying is that all you're entitled to is existing use value, and the market in that forced sale will deliver any hope value. So whatever you in your cloud cuckoo land think your land is worth, the market will tell you what it's really, really worth. So, with tools like that, you can start to address these issues. If anyone's done compulsory purchase, it's the back-to-back deal with the developer who's put in the bill that takes up all the work, 85% of the work, I would say. The actual CPO bit of it is, I wouldn't say it's straightforward, but it's not as complicated and difficult as a lot of people think. So, I think there are tools that if we had them and we had that proper overall framework, that was a grown-up framework in terms of land values, we could be a lot more effective and a lot more proactive.
Can I throw a slight spanner in that vision? And it's a policy spanner created for all of the best intentions, and I actually like it, but it is a spanner here, which is BNG.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the rhetoric again around grey belt, exactly for the same reasons that you were just talking about land value, Paul, also seem to assume that the sites in question won't be of a particularly high biodiversity value.
It doesn't follow.
And some of them might be. I mean, for example, if you're looking at a abandoned airstrip, for example, that's been vacant for quite some time, it could very easily be open mosaic habitat, which is very, very difficult to replace at the moment.
Yeah. Or an old rubbish dump. You can guarantee it will be rich in biodiversity.
So,
as I've experienced.
yeah.
For me, it should have been a design challenge to optimize biodiversity net gain. I've dealt with sites where redevelopment of a car park in a hospital to produce a multi-story car park, and they got a tatty bit of green wall, and the BNG is 250%. Well, yeah, because it was bugger all before, So and they could have done so much more, but they tick in the box with this bit of green wall. So I think it's an unfortunate policy in that I think it creating unrealistic challenges in some scenarios, but it's really under delivering significantly in other scenarios, and I think it's a shame.
It's also lawn.
I know.
Very hard to get rid of. But it raises all sorts of interesting impacts in this scenario, because we also don't quite know, or at least I haven't dealt with, let me know if you have, how the statutory BNG requirements interrelate with viability. Paul, have you come across that yet?
I mean, I'm assuming it'd just be a fixed cost, wouldn't it?
If I'm honest. Yeah,
because
it'd just be a cost you've got to take into account.
Yeah.
But it's a fixed cost top slice, because you can't go below that 10%. So are we going to end up in a situation a bit like Sill, where other aspects of good design or affordable housing get squeezed because of the cost of delivering BNG?
Well, I think in all viability arguments, the first casualty is always
Well, and
affordable
that's
housing.
the logical consequence, isn't it?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, the other Section 106 should be necessary in order to make the development acceptable. So, if they're necessary, you can't, likely set them aside. Affordable housing is just delivering planning policy, so that's going to be the first one on the chopping block on a viability appraisal.
So if you've got a greyfield site with open mosaic habitat, which is very, very expensive to offset, then the prospect of you getting to 50% affordable housing probably goes through the floor.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that will be the argument put forward. But that would be subject to their land value being appropriate.
I was going to say, and that sort of brings us back to where we were at the outset, really, doesn't it? That I think grey belt is a way of explaining why some parts of the green belt are appropriate to be released for development is perhaps a helpful shorthand. But as soon as you start trying to define all of this in planning policy terms, it gets really, really difficult. And there's all sorts of, it's easy if you say it fast, all sorts of unintended consequences and knock-on effects. And to make the system more complicated than it already is, I would perhaps suggest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be helpful. I mean, we've had viability gaming, if you like, for at least 2, if not 3 decades, as far as I can remember, perhaps even a bit more than that. But it's been done without any rules, and it's only relatively recently, with the case in Islington, as it Parkhurst, that some rules have started to emerge, and they've been captured in the PPG. So this sort of almost ignoring planning policy, and it's all about the developer maximising what they get is now, I think, a thing of the past. If you actually read the advice properly and apply it, and things have improved a bit. But I think government could go further on that and make it much clearer, so that you're not. I mean, I was advising, and I won't say where it is, but it was a greenbelt release, and the landowner did a viability appraisal that assumed the land value of £1.5 million an acre. It's greenbelt release. Why are you doing it from a benchmark land value? It should be, and there's a need for a big bit of kit on a nearby motorway, and they're saying, oh, it's not viable to do that. So no, it should be a residual valuation, and if that valuation is more than existing use value, which is next to nothing, then it actually is viable. The question then is whether you want to release it or not and earn £100,000 an acre, or £500,000 an acre, whatever that residual value is. But starting that we have a benchmark land value of £1.5 million an acre, when the land is actually worth, I don't know, £10,000 tops an acre, that's wrong. And government policy should say that's wrong and be much clearer on it. The trouble is, it's in too many people's difficult to do box, dealing with this stuff.
I mean, I don't want to get too much into viability because we will massively derail this discussion.
True, and yeah. As fun as it is.
As fun as it is. But I do have a great deal of sympathy with developers in this occasion, because they are the people who control the price of land.
No, but they're a player in that game.
They are a player in the game, but they are not the people who control the price of land, and they are carrying a lot of risk. So we need to recognise those two facts in any viability process. And fundamentally, if we want to have a look at reducing land values or having a more realistic approach to land values, we need to try and get more land into the system, which brings us to public sector, crown estates, universities, and the people who are large landholders who could actually make a difference here.
Well, one of the landowners was in that list. I won't say which one it was. So yeah, it wasn't a private landowner. So, you know, they're all playing that game, and that's wrong. And we need to reset those rules. And you know, the more land costs, the higher the risk for developers, because it's a bigger chunk of money in that equation. So if we can have a more reasonable land market, a small reduction in the risk for developers will be a result of that. I'm not saying it's significant, but it's a small reduction.
Paul, I suspect that this might be something you have a view on.
Well, you know, you're right, Nicola, in that developers don't set the price of land, and you know, we sell lots of land to developers, and I can absolutely promise you that they're after paying the smallest amount of money they can, because it does reduce the risk. But more importantly, you know, the key financial metric for house builders is really return on capital employed, and land value goes out up front. So by minimising what they can pay up front, their financial performance is better. I think where it starts to get more complicated than that, though, I think we've got to be careful not to confuse gross land values, the headline transaction figure, with, you know, the net receipt to the landowner, because they do have to pay capital tax and things like that on it, which, you know, can take out quite a big chunk. And also things like, especially if it's agricultural land, the inheritance tax exemptions that you can get from putting land on if it's in an agricultural use. So again, there's potentially big tax benefits there. And these are all things that landowners think about. You know, they go and get tax advice before they make these decisions. And often they'll take the view, you know, I've met a landowner who didn't get planning permission on their site eventually. And often they'll take the view, well, okay, if that's the level that it might transact at, I'd rather wait. And that starts to become, you know, that starts to become a challenge. And what we have seen is the supply of land on the market does have a material impact on the values that it can transact at. And I've seen settlements. I've seen settlements where there've been lots of planning permissions granted all around the edge of it, and there've been sort of 6 or 7 development sites, all being built, and the land values are become really low relative to the house prices because there's not as much interest in it, because there are lots of people who already own a piece of land in that area. You know, so it is, yes, house prices have an impact on what developers will pay, but so does the supply of land. And when the supply of land becomes tight, developers start paying more money for it, because they need to secure something to be able to keep that production pipeline going, because they need to, you know, they'll know that they'll have 3-year plans, and they'll know, well, this is the site that's going to shut down 3 years from now, so we've got to have something to come on stream, and actually I don't have anything. You know, and we see it in the offers that we get, that you get a desperate developer and they'll pay they'll end up paying 10, 20, 30% more than other developers will bid on the same piece of land. But because that almost becomes the market price, then that's the figure that starts setting expectations. So there's lots of moving parts in all of this. And I think it's quite easy to say, yes, there's a huge uplift when planning permission is granted, but it isn't quite as straightforward as that in terms of the thought processes of either developers or landowners. And we need to accept the realities of that. You know, when we're making these decisions about how we interact with those things. What I would say in terms of planning gain, I know we're getting wildly off topic, but
we are. There's another talk.
What I would say about planning gain. Yeah, but I was going to say, one of the best things that we can do to make sure that planning gain and it is actually delivered is be really clear up front as to what's going to be required. And, you know, all too often you don't find out what the 106 conditions will be until after the application is submitted. And because the land value is already set at that point. If it's really clear up front, developers just factor it into their appraisal, and it does come off the land value, and everybody's competing on a level playing field, and it's much easier to deliver it. the more opaque the requirements are, the more likely you are to end up with the applicant being the person who got the estimate most wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I think we didn't pick up that ball when SIL came in. But part of our job now is to proactively deliver infrastructure, and that all the components you need to do that. Crucial starting point is to be very, very clear about your infrastructure delivery plan, a proper plan, not just a silly old shopping list. And not many authorities pick that ball up, and we suffer as a result.
Hello, viewers. Sam again. My thanks to Nicola, Mike, and Paul for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other two, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution and greater than local planning, and planning for infrastructure and the environment. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners. And so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. Please also feel free to share this video on your social platforms. Anybody that does will be entitled to an exclusive 50 Shades mug. My thanks to podcast partners Kratos for helping me put these videos together. What have we learnt, viewers? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of 50 Shades of Planning, which is brought to you in partnership with Kratos. Kratos are a leading communications consultancy providing integrated strategic communications and campaigns across multiple sectors. We have helped some of the UK's best-known brands deliver local and national campaigns, manage political and reputational risks, and influence national policy on some of the most important issues facing the UK. We are more than an agency, we are change makers. Find out more at kratos.co.uk.